All right, let's talk about schizophrenia and schizophrenic disorders. Okay, we're going to spend most of the time talking about schizophrenia, as that is the major one that has the highest occurrence, and also is the basis by which we talk about other schizophrenic disorders or schizotypal disorders, because they all share a lot of the same symptoms. So, first, let's talk about the word psychosis, which is a more general term, just meaning that somebody is losing touch with reality in some key fashion. You'll see psychosis talked about, or psychotic episodes talked about, as if that's its own diagnosis. And it's not necessarily, rather, it's a feature of other disorders. Um, so if someone is referred to as psychotic, um, it means that they're behaving in ways that don't correspond with the reality that everybody else is observing. So it's just sort of a generalized term. Um, the most common disorder for which psychosis appears, or in which psychosis appears, is schizophrenia, which is a sort of umbrella of symptoms that are all related to the perception of and response to the reality that you perceive. And when that gets out of sync too badly with what the people around you are perceiving and responding to, then we're talking about schizophrenia. So this is something that happens, or occurs in roughly 1% of the population. And so you can sort of see the numbers there worldwide. We're talking about 21 million, 3.6 million in the United States. So that's 1% in the United States. It's lower elsewhere, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later in terms of the distribution worldwide and how we respond to it. This is one where there are no gender differences in terms of diagnosis, and it's a disorder that usually shows up sometime during early adulthood, mid 20s, sometimes as late as the 30s. Um, and that's when it tends to, these symptoms tend to show up. It can be as early as the late teens, right? Now, this is something that we care about, try to deal with, because the costs associated with schizophrenia are pretty high. It's a very disruptive disorder. You've got 25% of people suffering from schizophrenia attempt suicide, which is, of course, much higher than normal. And these folks are also more likely to be susceptible to other physical illnesses. Excuse me. I'm sorry you had to hear that. Now, this is a disorder that tends to show up most in those in the lowest levels of wealth and socioeconomic status. So you see here the prevalence rate is up near 2% for those making less than 20,000 a year, and less than half that for even the next level up from 20 to 40,000. Now there's a couple of different explanations as why that might be. Um, One is that there are simply more stressors associated with being low income. And so, if we talk about the prevalence of the disorder as being a combination of a genetic predisposition with an exposure then to highly stressful events that then triggers the onset of the disease, which is one of the things that we'll talk about when we talk about why schizophrenia happens. Well, that's more, you're more likely to run into those stressful initiatory events when you don't have enough income or resources to confront most of the stressors that you deal with. So that's going to happen more for folks in lower income. There is also the idea that those who struggle to maintain their relationships and live sort of a normal everyday life are going to struggle more to both get and keep a job, and so are likely to make less. And so you observe some evidence that folks who develop schizophrenia then drift towards the lower income levels because they simply can't manage their lives when untreated, um, and keep a job. So both of those things are likely true. Okay, so what are we talking about as far as schizophrenia goes? We have different categories of symptoms, each of which I'll go over one at a time. Delusions, hallucinations, which are two separate things, but we'll talk about that here in a sec. Disorganized speech, abnormal physical functioning in terms of how they move, their motor behavior, and then there's negative symptoms as well. Once again, I'll define those for you here in just a minute. So the person has to have one of these three primary ones. They have to either be experiencing delusions or hallucinations or disorganized speech in order for it to be classified as schizophrenia. And these symptoms need to last for at least 1 month, and then they need to show impaired functioning in their life for 6 months or more. And at that point, then we're talking about schizophrenia. Okay, so I mentioned negative symptoms before. Some of the others are grouped together into what we call positive symptoms, and then we've got psychomotor symptoms. Now, how this all can develop for the individual can vary widely in terms of which of these symptoms show up, when they show up, to what severity they show up. In fact, there's so much variability there that some researchers believe that we actually have a group of disorders here that all should be categorized separately. That's not something that has stuck yet as far as the DSM is concerned, but that's something we continue to look into. So let's talk about the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. Now, when I say positive and negative, I don't mean good and bad. These are all uniformly bad in terms of somebody's function and managing to maintain their everyday life. However, when we're talking about positive symptoms, we're talking about symptoms that are added to that are above and beyond what the normal person experiences. It's adding to the person's behavior. Negative symptoms are those where the person is missing normal behavior. So that's what we mean by positive and negative. At any rate, I'm sorry, I got distracted there for a second. So when we're talking about positive symptoms, we're talking about delusions, hallucinations, and disordered speech. So let's talk about those one by one. So delusions are how am I going to describe this? Delusions are errors of thought that lead someone to believe that something is occurring that no one else sees occurring, right? So it's believing that the way the world works or what's going on with you is different than what the people observing you would think it is, to an extent that it causes distress and dysfunction, right? So you've got different kinds of delusion. The most common are delusions of persecution, where you believe that people are out to get you and are you interpret the behavior that people are pointing at you or demonstrating towards you as being harmful to you when other people don't perceive it as being so. So that person is out to get me and is trying to make my life hard and wants my job or is trying to ruin my relationships. And the other people around you are going, well, I'm just not seeing it, right? So that's a delusion of persecution. Delusions of reference is when you believe you are being referred to when other people don't perceive it that way. So frequently delusions of reference are thinking that the TV is talking to you or believing that you have a personal relationship with a celebrity or public personality, where when they say something publicly, you feel like it's pointed at you specifically rather than the general public. So you're messed up on your references, right? Who is being referred to? Is it everybody? Are they speaking about everybody generally? Or when they talk vaguely about that relationship that they're having, are they secretly talking about you, right? Um, and so believing that that reference is pointed at you rather than at someone else or at no one, it's just a general reference, is what we call delusions of reference. Delusions of grandeur, believing that you are more important, more central, more unique than other people see and feel. Now, you got to be careful with this one, right? Because you scroll back to when you were 14 and everybody's got delusions of grandeur, right? Everybody feels like they are the most important person in the world. If everybody could just understand how awesome I am, they would make me president. Um, the issue here is the extent to which that occurs and then the behaviors that result from it. So I remember listening to a radio program years ago now, talking about a man who was suffering from schizophrenia, and he described his experience, his psychotic break as he experienced it. Well, he was reporting on it later. He was, medicated and doing all right and seeing things clearly, but then reporting back, telling the story about what had happened. He came to believe that he was the body double for Barack Obama. This was a young black man living here in the United States. Came to believe he was the body double for the then president, right? So he started to think that he was someone who would get flown in for events where it was too dangerous for the president to actually be there, but where the president needed to be seen. But then this one particular evening, he came to think that he was coming under attack, that people were on the way to his apartment to kidnap him so that they could, if I remember right, kill Barack Obama and then whisk him off to some other part of the world and set him up as like a puppet, so that they could control the U.S. government. And so to escape the people who were presumably coming to his house, he jumped out the second story window, somehow managed not to break his legs, stole a car, and drove across town. He managed to maintain enough clarity to realize something's not right, I'm not thinking correctly, and so he drove himself to the hospital, which he crashed into on the way there because he lost control of the car because he believed he was being pursued. And it was, a very difficult situation. But as you can see, that's a delusion of grandeur. He believes he is someone more important, more central, a part of the big picture, when most of us are very little cogs in the big picture. And it's this an increasing distance between what you perceive and what other people around you are perceiving. And then delusions of control. Excuse me. The idea that either you are able to control objects and situations that are not under your control, or that others are able to control you in ways that we don't recognize as being possible. The common phrase of wearing a tinfoil hat refers to these delusions of control. Somebody who is concerned that there are satellites or aliens or whatever the case may be that can change their brain function through the air, and so they put on the tinfoil hat to block the rays. These are the most common types of delusions. There are others, but these are the ones that show up most frequently. Okay, other positive symptoms. Disorganized speech and thinking. And so you most commonly see this with speech. That's what gets noticed. You can have disorganized thinking that does lead to disorganized speech. So the things that show up here, you've got loose associations where you'll jump from or derail yourself from one train of thought to the next based on an association of a word that you're using, that then leads you to another train of thought, but the train of thought is far enough away that other people have a hard time following you. So I've got in my notes here an example. The problem is insects. My brother used to collect insects. He's now a man 5'10". You know, 10's my favorite number. I also like to dance, draw, and watch TV. Now, all of those thoughts are connected, right? You can see how you get from one to the next, but they're not logically connected in terms of I'm holding a conversation and you can follow along with what I'm talking about. So that's what we mean when we say loose associations or derailment. Neologisms, the usage of words that making up new words, right, that don't exist and treating them as normal. Perseveration is when you get stuck. So to persevere, right, is normally something that we think of as a good thing. We're sticking with something. Perseveration comes from the same root word, but in psychology is usually thought of as a negative thing, where you get stuck on something and can't disengage from a thought or a word. So this is somebody who is repeating the same things over and over again beyond the point at which they make sense. Clanging or rhymes is when you are stuck in rhyming mode, where you say things that rhyme excessively and nonsensically. Again, dealing with loose association here. Frequently, this disorganized thinking will then lead to inappropriate affect. Affect, hopefully you have heard this used this way before in psychology, but it's just a term that we use to mean feeling. So inappropriate display of feelings, where someone is laughing hysterically at a terribly violent scene in a movie, or that's not intended to be, over the top or funny. Or is terribly angry when someone is trying to share something emotional or intimate with them. These emotional responses, inappropriate emotional responses, are a feature of lots of different disorders. So there can be comorbidities that occur with schizophrenia. Also, along with that, there's the idea that the person may be having an emotional response to other features of their own schizophrenic disorder, right? So you're talking to them and suddenly they're ranting and raving and storming up and down the sidewalk. That may be in response to a hallucination that they're experiencing or a delusion that is occurring and not necessarily to anything that you yourself said. Okay, hallucinations is the last big set of symptoms within our positive symptoms. This is when you perceive things as occurring that other people do not perceive, right? Most common type of hallucinations in schizophrenia are auditory hallucinations. And you see a picture of a brain here that shows an abnormal brain activation as someone experiences an auditory hallucination. That you can see they're experiencing lots of activation in their temporal lobe, which is the part of your brain that is primarily responsible for processing auditory information. But there is not a corresponding activation in the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that helps us determine what the source of that sound is. And so it is the brain itself producing stimulation that gets translated as auditory, but you can't tell where it's coming from, right? And so quite frequently with schizophrenia, you get people hearing voices, people yelling at them or telling them what to do. You can have visual and even tactile hallucinations as well. Those are less common, but they do occur within this group of symptoms. Okay, so worth talking about just for a second before we move on to the negative symptoms, that hallucinations and delusions, those are sort of two primary ones that we usually think about when we talk about schizophrenia and the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. Those are two separate things, right? They may correspond with each other, right? Maybe the person who believes he's Barack Obama and is experiencing that delusion, then hears auditory hallucinations of people down the hall coming to storm his apartment, and that's what leads him to jump out the window. So they may dovetail, but they're separate symptoms, right? Okay. Now, our negative symptoms are a little bit harder to notice because they're things that aren't there instead of things that are extra that are there. Um, so, what the most common ones that show up are poverty of speech or alogia, a lack of speech, where they either don't say much at all, or when they do speak, there is not much meaningful content to the words. Um, and then restricted affect, so a change, a reduction in the emotional response that they are demonstrating to situations around themselves. Um, this goes together with a reduction in eye contact, so frequently folks suffering from schizophrenia will not want to make eye contact and will show either blunted affect, which is a reduction in emotional response, or flat affect, which is the absence of emotional response. So, someone who simply speaks in an utter monotone and shows no emotional response whatsoever to what's being said. Um, Now, you normally think, well, I'm not that emotional, right? I don't respond emotionally. Yet, even as I'm talking here, I am displaying subtle markers of emotion, whether it's happiness or boredom or humor or whatever the case may be. And we're really finely tuned and keyed to pay attention to those emotional markers in everyday speech. And so when someone shows no emotional reaction whatsoever, uh, in response to what's being said to them or what's going on around them, we notice really, really quickly that that's somebody who's not behaving correctly, right? Another negative symptom is the loss of volition, avolition, it's sometimes called, where you feel drained of energy and you don't care about your usual things. You can't get started on anything or follow it through. You feel ambivalent, where you can't make decisions or hold opposing viewpoints on the same thing. Now, everybody feels these things to some extent, right? At least most of us, right? There are plenty of days where I'm like, I don't care, make it all go away, and I don't know what's going on. So this again needs to be at a level where it's causing distress and dysfunction, not just like, I don't feel like doing my homework today. Well, congratulations, that's all of us. Um, okay. Then our last category of symptoms is our psychomotor symptoms, um, where you have changes in movement, where a person may engage in odd gestures or repeated grimaces or unusual twitches, and those movements may even seem to have additional meaning or impact for that individual. Right? You go back to the delusions of control, and perhaps if I move in a particular way, then that causes some effect, and so I'm going to do it over and over again. Right? Even though there's no evidence that that's actually occurring. Um, in extreme cases, roughly 10% of people with schizophrenia will experience rigidity and essentially a freezing of the body and an absence of awareness and thought and responsiveness at the same time. Um, so the person stops moving and stops responding. This is what we call catatonia or catatonia. Um, where the person becomes non-responsive and may not even be conscious. Now, somebody can be catatonic without schizophrenia. There are certain folks suffering from, oh, I'm struggling with the name. It's the one where people have a hard time staying awake. Wow. I'm totally blanking on the name. I want to say kleptomania, but that's stealing things. That's wrong. Excuse me. And you're yelling at the screen right now because you remember the name because it's something that shows up all of the time. It is. I've known somebody with this disorder. Um, wow. I'm sorry. I'm totally blanking. At any rate, whatever the name of that disorder is, I'm sorry, where folks fall asleep at inappropriate times, and are unable to regulate their sleep-wake cycles normally. Um, you will occasionally get folks who experience catatonic episodes where when they lose consciousness, they will then, their eyes will remain open and they become non-responsive and can't move. That's entirely separate. I mean, it's the same symptoms, right? It is catatonia, but it is entirely separate in that instance from the occurrences that show up of catatonia in schizophrenia. And the disorder is narcolepsy. Wow. Okay. At least I remembered it eventually. Okay, now those are our symptoms, right? Those are the ones, and we, as we said, these can show up at different times in different combinations for different individuals, but there is a usual course of the disorder in terms of how it shows up for folks. Usually, you have 3 phases, starting sometime between the late teens and the mid-30s, where you go from the prodromal stage, where a person begins to experience some of these symptoms in a mild way, and then it turns to the active stage where those symptoms get worse and more troublesome. And then frequently the person will then move to the residual phase where the symptoms become less pronounced again, but continue, right? Now those phases can last for anywhere from days to years, and can in fact go away entirely. There are people who just recover spontaneously from schizophrenia. Um, Now, you're more likely to recover entirely if you were high functioning before the symptoms showed up. If the onset of the disorder was marked by some extreme stressor that then later went away or that you learned to deal with, that goes hand in hand with abrupt onset. The later it is when you get these symptoms, the more likely it is that you'll recover. And if you get treated early, then you're more likely to recover. Okay, in order to receive a diagnosis of schizophrenia, according to the DSM-5, you need to have symptoms of the disorder for 6 months or more, um, and you need to have active symptoms, meaning that you need to be in the active phase of the development of schizophrenia, where those symptoms are um, very prevalent and very disruptive for at least one of those 6 months. And it needs to have gotten worse from what it was before, right? Now, there are other disorders that share many of their symptoms with schizophrenia. So you've got schizophreniform disorder and schizoaffective disorder. With schizophreniform disorder, it's the same symptoms except a shorter duration. So that's 1 to 6 months, right? So if the symptoms have lasted more than a month, less than 6 months, you're dealing with schizophreniform disorder. And in fact, there's another one that's not listed here, which is, I believe, called brief psychotic disorder. It's on one of my slides here. I'm not sure I've got that name right. At any rate, if the symptoms last for less than a month, that's what you're dealing with. Now, schizoaffective disorder, you have the symptoms of schizophrenia together with either a full-blown manic or depressive episode. So that's a sort of mix between bipolar disorder and schizophrenia is schizoaffective disorder. Okay, in order, you do have 2 types that lots of researchers talk about. Type 1 schizophrenia is primarily dominated by positive symptoms. Type 2 is primarily dominated by negative symptoms. And here we are, brief psychotic disorder. That's the one I was talking about. I think I said that right. And then you've got, if you want to take a closer look over this, just pause it and read through this. You're more than welcome to. You've also got delusional disorder, where the symptoms are milder, where you are specifically experiencing delusions, but they are not as severe as they would be in schizophrenia. They're less far removed from reality. So this is thinking that your neighbor is, I don't know, stealing your mail. when they're not. So that's within the realm of possibility, right? Far more so than I'm a stand-in for the president. But nevertheless, if it's delusional, if it is not corresponding with the reality that other people perceive, then that's going to cause you plenty of problems, right? Accusing your neighbor of stealing your mail all the time. Then you can, of course, have some of these symptoms due to the presence of other medical disorders. If you have some sort of illness or brain damage, you can get hallucinations, delusions, disorganized speech. And those symptoms can also show up due to the presence of substance use or abuse. So if you get these symptoms because of the presence of some substance, then that is substance or medication-induced psychotic disorder. So those are our schizophrenic disorders, right? And I think I'll stop it there. And in our other video, we will talk about how we treat this and what we think is really going on here.